Yes, yeah.
So thank you for inviting me. And let me start by expressing my condolences, because all of you will have lost um, members of your family, friends, loved ones over these last 3 years. And I just want to start by expressing my sorrow and my condolences. And just also expressing how important it is to remember every single one who perished. And I'm sure I was not alone in being both very moved and very impressed by the 3 days of mourning recently organized in Tigray for those who lost their lives fighting with the Tigray Defense Forces. And I think that was very appropriate and very important, and I'll come back to that. And I'm expecting that, as with the long liberation war of 1975 to 1991, those who lost their lives to massacre, to arbitrary killings, will also be memorialized. But I want to raise the question of the fact that it is no less important to find a way to remember those who perished of hunger. And also to point to some of the challenges and implications of doing this. And it's important, I think, because remembrance of the victims of starvation crimes is an act of emancipation. And let me explain. For those who've been through the experience of starvation, it's often the experience of living in what we might call a gray zone. This was the term that Primo Levi, the survivor of Auschwitz, used to describe the experience of hunger in the concentration camp. It's also the word that's been used by historians of the Irish famine of the 1840s to describe that experience. It's the corrosive effect of hunger. It's the petty cruelties and indignities experienced, inflicted, and especially those little cruelties inflicted by one hungry person on another that are the searing experiences, the marks on conscience, the marks on memory. And let me elaborate. It's the experience that a mother has when she has only the resources to treat one of her children. So who is the child who will get the treatment, and who is the child who will be denied? It's the experience of the householder who does have some food, whose starving neighborly children are knocking at the door, begging for food. And that householder decides to turn them away to keep this very small amount of food for his or her own family. It's those pensioners who, having worked and saved all their lives with a sense of dignity and self-worth, are forced to beg for scraps. And they feel that humiliation deep inside themselves. It's the family that has inherited jewelry from the grandmothers, who are forced to sell those treasured heirlooms for a pittance. And with this comes feelings of shame, of guilt, of indignity. And these are what are so abiding. And this is the reason why so many episodes of famine are in social and historical memory, are glossed over. They are not spoken about. It took more than 150 years for the descendants of the survivors of the Great Famine in Ireland to begin to talk about it, precisely for these reasons. And what is, I think, important for us to do is to articulate the fact that these acts were carried out in the shadow, in the context of a great crime, the crime of imposed starvation, starvation imposed on a whole community, a whole people, with genocidal intent. And we need to be able to say to those who suffered this the pains of hunger and the indignities and cruelties of the social experience of hunger, we need to be able to say to them, it was not your fault. This was something done to you. And we need for them to be able to say, with true confidence and true self-belief, it was not our fault. And that is what I mean by remembrance of starvation crimes being an act of emancipation. So we need to be able to name the perpetrator and seek justice. And we all know who those perpetrators were and indeed are. And we know who their accomplices were and those who seek to pretend this crime was not perpetrated. So the war crime of starvation is defined first of all, in the Geneva Conventions, the additional protocols of 1977, and then in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. It's defined as the deprivation, destruction, or rendering useless of objects indispensable to survival. And that includes food, but it also includes water, medicine and health facilities, shelter. It also includes maternal care for children, anything that is indispensable for human survival. And in an extended sense, it means anything that is indispensable for human beings to survive as a meaningful community, as a meaningful collective entity, a family with dignity, with self-reliance, with a sense of themselves. And so starvation in a starvation crime of the character that was inflicted and indeed is being inflicted on the people of Tigray is an attempt to destroy the future and the community. Children being unable to attend school, malnourished children who, because they were deprived of nutrients before they were born or in those early tender years, will grow up, physically stunted, unable to achieve their full mental and physical capabilities. And a generation that bears the trauma of what they witnessed and what they experienced. And as I mentioned, historical experience from elsewhere suggests that it takes several generations for this trauma to be processed and articulated. In addition to which we have the destruction of livelihoods, the destruction of the economy, setting back development by decades. In this context, let me also add a few words about sexual violence. Rape is a crime. We know that. And systematic, widespread rape is a crime against humanity. It can be a crime. It can be a crime, an act constitutive of the crime of genocide. But like starvation, rape is also a crime whose victims and survivors too often blame themselves, and they live with societal stigma, ostracism for the rest of their lives. And in that sense, rape is also a starvation crime. During those terrible months of the occupation of Tigray, still parts of Tigray are still occupied, but the occupation of all of Tigray from the end of 2020 until June of 2021, the fear of rape prevented many women and girls from following activities indispensable for survival. But look, there's a legacy here too, that survivor of rape may find herself unable to care for herself or her children. She may suffer lifelong physical or emotional disabilities. She may suffer social ostracization and shame that prevents her from leading the life to which she is entitled, and indeed her children from leading the lives to which they are entitled. And we have the phenomenon, very common, very difficult, very painful to acknowledge, of children born of rape, who it was not their fault. They didn't ask to be born, but they may never have what is necessary for them to live a meaningful life. They will always be victims of the deprivation of what is required for them to live a proper life, which is the crime of starvation. So I don't need to enumerate the starvation crimes perpetrated. The crimes of starvation perpetrated against the people of Tigray were many. I've been working on this issue. My first research in the 1980s was into starvation. And I have never witnessed in my professional career, in my historical research, such systematic, such ruthless, such cruel starvation crimes perpetrated as those inflicted on the people of Tigray. The most extreme, the most comprehensive were committed during those months of occupation, and the siege that followed was among the most severe in recorded history. These were crimes, and they came in the immediate aftermath of a sustained effort by scholars, activists, lawyers, and diplomats to raise the issue of starvation crimes at the United Nations, at the African Union, at the Conference of State Parties to the Rome Statute, the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2417 on armed conflict and hunger, an amendment to the Rome Statute specifically prohibiting starvation in non-international armed conflicts. But yet, the African Union and the United Nations, despite their obligations to call this out and act, they did nothing. They should hang their heads in shame for an abject moral failure. And as I said, this crime of starvation is not in the past. The siege is still not fully lifted. The funds for essential humanitarian activities and for reconstruction are woefully inadequate. And the pain of starvation continues among all the survivors, especially the survivors of rape, those who've lost their livelihoods, those children who are far behind in their education. But let me close my remarks so that we can have a little bit of time for Q&A with just one more hopeful observation, which really struck me during those 3 days of mourning, which was that the intent of those who waged war against the people of Tigray was to break the spirit of the people of Tigray. And starvation was one of the tools. In fact, there is the Polish lawyer and activist Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term starvation, who coined the term genocide, who campaigned successfully for the International Convention to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. He gave a remarkable lecture on the Holodomor, which was the genocidal famine inflicted by Stalin on Ukraine in the 1930s. And he described how that was an attempt to break the spirit of the Ukrainian people, and that starvation was, in his view, the most powerful, penetrating, ruthless tool to break the spirit of a people, particularly a peasant people or an agrarian people for whom growing food and sharing food is absolutely at the heart of their identities. And the aim, clearly the intent of the federal government in Addis Ababa, the state of Eritrea, the regional government of Amhara, was to break that spirit of the people of Tigray. But those days of mourning, which were done with that extraordinary collective spirit, showed that that effort clearly had failed.